Well, good evening and very warm welcome to tonight's public lecture, which is our first actually here at More Music. So a really big thank you to the team here for hosting us. It's great to be here. Whether it's your first public lecture you've attended or we've seen you before, we're really pleased to welcome you to a Lancaster University public lecture, and we hope you really enjoy it. These events are a really important part of our engagement programme, both locally and in the region. And we aim to host lectures that are meaningful and relevant, but most of all, interesting. And I'm sure that this one is definitely going to be no exception to that. We're really delighted to welcome Dr. Kirsty Dunn, who is lecturer in development psychology at Lancaster University. Kirsty specialises in the investigation of perceptual, cognitive and social development in the womb and throughout the first year of life. Using light and 4D ultrasound, Kirsty and her global team have pioneered a new window into discovering how those remarkable abilities that we already have at birth develop before we're born. Kirsty's lecture is going to take us on a journey inside the womb to find out how the things that we hear, see, taste and feel before birth are already influencing our abilities and preference for what we like to see and listen to after birth. So it's a real honour to have you with us tonight, Kirsty, and without any more delay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kirsty Dunn.
Great, thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you everybody for coming this evening. So yes, I will be talking about prenatal development, what we know about what we can learn before we're born. But first of all, what I thought I would do is just take a little step back and think about what is developmental psychology. So what it's not is just finding what abilities we have at the earliest possible age. It's about thinking about if we can particular ability at a particular age, under particular conditions, what does that mean for how we develop? It's about thinking about the mechanisms of change, and if we can know those mechanisms of change, what they mean for how we develop. Some think it's about thinking about why things might go wrong in development and how to fix that if it does, and to a certain extent, yes, it is, but it's also about thinking about what does it look like for things to go right, and what are the conditions we require for things to go as they typically should. It's about understanding difference, though, and understanding what that means for that person, and informing society on how to incorporate and support that difference. It's also about thinking mostly about change. So humans have a remarkable ability to change. It's what makes us human. We see a film, or we listen to a piece of music, or we have an interaction with another person, and it can fundamentally change the way in which we make decisions going forwards. To what extent can we change, and when does that begin? We don't really have a definitive answer on that, and I'm not going to give you the answers from this talk, but I am going to give you some ways in which I try to answer these questions. So, what's it like to be a developmental psychologist? There are some perks, there are some challenges. We're trying to work out what psychological abilities we have in infants, toddlers, and children, and that requires some creativity. We do have some tools. We look at, for example, what choices infants make when they have choices of objects to play with. How do they play with them? In what order? So these are behavioural measures. We sometimes use eye tracking to look at not just how long a baby might look to a visual scene, but in what order do they survey what's on that screen, and in what way. We sometimes use neurological measures to measure at what point and whereabouts in the brain do we respond when we see, for example, a visual scene or hear a piece of auditory stimuli, be that speech or anything else. But we also have to get quite creative, because if you want to show something to an infant and you want them to look at that for a particular time, you're going to have to make it interesting. So sometimes you can get to the point where you've got the most interesting game in the world, but you may have a toddler arrives that sees your game and wants to play it in their own way. They don't know what it is that you want from them. Equally, they might not want to play at all, and they have their own ways of telling us that. Which brings me to this, you're going to hear babies cry. So babies cry, it's one of their only communications tools, especially in those earlier months. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've gone home smelling of baby sick, and the first time as a naive master's student I encountered the concept of an explosive nappy was quite an eye-opener. Training and learning can be difficult in how to run these tasks. Here I am trying to teach one of my students in a live situation how to run her task without distracting the baby and ruining it for her, so I'm hiding behind a chair for the whole thing. But it's also really rewarding. Children are so different, and every single time I've run a study, somebody has done something that's really blown me away and I didn't expect. And here I am getting some time to play with one of our visitors, and I don't think there are many jobs in the world where you can genuinely say that you got paid today to play in a ball pit. So why on earth did we think that we could study psychology in the womb? And actually, the vast majority of neurons are already produced in the first half of pregnancy. They're being developed at a rate of 250,000 per minute. And all of the senses are pretty well in place by 5 to 7 months, depending on the sense. So the auditory sense is well developed by 5 months. Vision takes a little longer, and actually, it continues to develop, certainly in terms of acuity, after birth. We have plenty of sensory input to those senses. It's not been all that long since we thought that the womb was an entirely black place, void of vision, and that our first visual insight happened at birth. We now know that's not the case, and not only do we have light travelling through to the womb, we need it for healthy eye development. In terms of sounds, we have plenty of auditory input. We've got the biological sounds from the mother. Also, the speech of the mother will travel through the mother just like any other vibration, and externally through the uterine wall, in addition to the noises around her. So the senses are developed, we've got input to those senses, but is the brain doing anything with it? And I think that this graph demonstrates this really well. What this is latency of neural responses to auditory tones. So it's how quick the brain is responding when we play a tone. And the circles are fetuses and the squares are infants. And what we see here is this really nice slow reduction in the time it takes to respond to a tone. So we're just slowly getting better over time from prenatal phase into postnatal phase. We don't all of a sudden see that those squares have a big step in ability. So why would we think that a newborn baby could do something remarkably different to a fetus in late gestation? We weren't exactly the first people to think about this, though. This has been known in developmental psychology. It's just incredibly difficult to study it, which means that though we know we have development before birth, across a lot of textbooks, we still see a lot of depictions of development like this, where it starts at birth. And that's because you've got two challenges. Earlier I talked about ways in which we present stimuli to babies, their visual experiences, their visual patterns and shapes, their auditory sounds. It's one thing to present a sound to a fetus, but it's another to try and deliver a pattern of information. We also need to measure response. How do you measure a behavioural response of a human being inside another human being? So really technological advances is what slowed this field down until now. There have been some ways of getting around this. So people have seen preterm infants. So, for example, these infants are of the gestational age where they would typically be in the womb, but you can now present whatever you would present postnatally in an older infant, and you can measure it in the same way. So this is a good way of getting around this to a certain extent. This study in the 80s was a big step forward in that they presented auditory information before birth and then measured ability to process that after birth. So for the last 6 weeks of pregnancy, twice a day, they asked mums to read Cat in the Hat. And then they asked another half of mums to read Dog in the Fog. So it's the same extract, they've just changed Cat in the Hat to Dog in the Fog. And then at birth, they measured their preference for listening to these stories. So they did that through what's called a non-nutritional sucking paradigm. So we have this little newborn baby here, and they have some headphones on and a dummy. And when they suck on the dummy, the headphone plays one of those two stories. And what they begin to do is suck more to listen to what is rewarding, what they prefer to listen to. So the babies that were listening to Dog in the Fog preferred to listen to that. The babies that were listening to Cat in the Hat preferred to listen to that, which is brilliant because it taught us that not only are they processing things in the womb, they're actually learning it, the memory is storing it, and it is driving their preference behaviour at birth. But what it doesn't tell us is what's the nature of that learning. When did they start learning? Did they start learning at 34 weeks when the study began? Did they start learning at 37 weeks? Did they need 1 week of hearing it to be able to learn it? Did they need the full 6 weeks to be able to learn it? So we need a little bit more detail in order to really understand the sophistication of the learning system before birth. So this is where I sort of call for in utero methods, where you can deliver stimuli but measure the response at the same time. Barbara Kiselewski and her colleagues have been running some really great fetal heart rate studies. And the way in which this works is that when the brain, just like any other muscle, when you need to use it, your heart rate will change to change the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood levels in the brain. And so what happens is, if you're listening to something over a period of time and something changes in the auditory environment, your brain will need to work, and therefore your heart rate will change. So the fetuses do this. And it's a really good measure for being able to work out whether fetuses distinguish between two things. With technological advances, there are just a couple of places in the entire world with this machine and the expertise to use it. And it's an FMEG machine where they can measure fetal brain activity. So here is a mum resting her bump in this machine, and what's really clever about this is that it's custom made so that it has this light array on the inside to be able to display flashes of light. So it can't deliver patterns of light yet, but it can deliver flashes, and we can see that the brain is responding to visual, as in a flash of light. Here at Lancaster, we've been using a combination of methods in collaboration with Cumbria University, where we use fetal heart rate, but also we measure their behaviour response to different shapes of light and different sounds using ultrasound. But before I go on to talk about the work, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how it started. So it started with this man here, who is now at Waikato University in New Zealand. And he had the idea to apply for what was at the time an ESRC transformative grant. And his idea was to use light to present shapes to a fetus and to use ultrasound to measure their head turns towards it. So this type of grant is designed for people who might have an idea that's really out there, but if it actually works, would take us 10 steps forward in our understanding. So thankfully he got it, because that meant that I could apply for the research associate post on it. And the idea was to look at face processing. So at birth, we know that newborn babies prefer to look at faces over anything else. Even as adults, we prefer faces. We see faces in things that are not faces. We put eyelashes on cars, see faces in clouds. We just have this drive to see faces. But it doesn't stop there. So we prefer to see faces at birth, but we also prefer to look at things that look like faces. So for example here, this is not actually a face. It's 3 squares in the shape of a face. So just to describe the study here, what Johnson and Morton did in the 90s was present this shape to the front of this newborn infant, and then they move it away. And this here is a protractor. And it's just measuring, what they're doing is just measuring how far the newborn is willing to track this shape before returning to their resting position. And they're willing to track this shape far more than if that shape's upside down. So this is a good candidate for us to start with, mostly because that is not very complex and we needed a relatively simple shape to try to get through to the fetus. So just to talk a little bit about that, the concept of light travelling through biological tissue is not new. This is a piece of art from the 18th century where they're really beautifully depicting light travelling through tissue. But it's one thing to have light travel through, and it's another thing to have a pattern on the other side of that. And that's because as light travels through, for example, fat tissue, it scatters. And as it travels through muscle tissue, it mostly absorbs. So what you quite easily end up with is a kind of duller blob on the other side. Nonetheless, we were going to give this a go. Nobody had done this before. So it's not like we could go to somebody and say, you know, how did you do this? Can we buy your technology that does what we want to do? Nobody had done it. So we started contacting various different academics with expertise in light, and mostly we're told, yeah, it can't be done, which was a little bit demotivating. But I just thought, okay, so this project might not work, but I don't want it to work because we haven't tried enough. So we started ordering various different types of light that would be safe with biological tissue, and at this point I contacted a company called Thor Labs who specialise in using lasers for various different healthcare needs. And I emailed the tech team email address and got a response from the CEO of the company, James Carroll. And he said, sounds great, let's Skype, back when you used to Skype people. And he spent half an hour talking to me. It subsequently turned out that he actually consults for NASA, but yet was spending half an hour of his time with me for free to talk about our project. And that was just really generous of him. So off the back of that, we went back to simple. We had 3 LEDs, red, spread as far enough apart to not create too much blur that they become a circle. So here we are. We have our sonographer, we have a light source, we have participants. This is the light source, so we start with 3 LEDs, and this is it in its face-like shape, and then that upside down, so it no longer looks like a face. And I just want to point out here that the sonographers really have the difficult part of this job. This is where the magic happens, because what they have got to do is try to create or try to keep an image of a fetal face at 34 weeks when we're running out of space and they want to put their hands in front of their face, and keep that image whilst we play things and show them things that we know are going to make them move. So they've got a real challenge here to keep following them around. But at this point we had everything ready to go, but we still were thinking, well, will they really do it? Will they actually be able to use their muscles to follow this shape of light? We didn't know. And then the first participant came in, and I put the light to the side of the face, and the fetus just immediately tracked at the light, and the atmosphere in the room completely changed. I don't think any of us in the room expected it to actually happen, but it had. So on we went. And so here are just some examples of some of the things that we saw. For this baby, the light source is to their right-hand side. For this baby, the light is on our left-hand side. And that is, in particular, is a nice video because that quite nicely shows how they return to the resting position when the lights are turned off. So what did the data look like? So the red bars here are number of head turns towards the face-like shapes, and the grey are number of head turns towards the non-face-like shapes, and we've got more looking towards the face-like than the non-face-like shape. We also looked at head turns away, and that's because we wanted to have a look. We wanted to make sure we weren't just looking at random movement here. And if you look at the red bars, they're more likely, or they were looking more towards the face-like than away from the face-like, but they were looking no more likely to look towards than away from the non-face-like shape. So, what were the implications? So we do have a preference to engage with face-like shapes prior to birth. It may be that there's something about the prenatal experience that drives this. We know that we prefer things that are familiar to us at birth, and certainly at this stage, but we don't know enough about what the prenatal environment actually looks like to be able to see, for example, is there just typically more visual information up here in their higher visual fields that's driving that? Or it may be that this is evidence for genetic underpinnings. We are seeing this 6 weeks before birth, but this study doesn't hugely provide evidence one way or the other on that until we know what the visual environment looks like. But it does show that the human fetus is engaging with shapes in the womb at 34 weeks in a similar way to newborn babies do when they're born. And I don't know if I mentioned this, but this hadn't been done before. So it showed that we could actually use these methods as well. So in a methodologically way, it could show us that visual cognition could be studied, and this is a way in which you could do it. So I then won a Leverhulme Trust Fellowship to spend a bit more time looking into this. So I wanted to look a little bit more about what we could measure in terms of what the fetus was doing, the way they were using their faces, the way they were moving in response to various different things that we presented them. And we went with looking at communication and language systems. So I had some great mentors in this. Vincent Reed continued to be a mentor. My PhD supervisor continued on helping me, Gavin Bremner, as well as an unofficial supervisor in Tim Donovan at Cumbria University. So it was an A team of assistants happening here. And just to go back at and look at the background for language development, people often describe the way in which we enter the world and then enter the concept of having to learn language. In James's quote, as we arrive, infants are born into a blooming, buzzing confusion. We all of a sudden just have this explosion of languages around us and all of these objects. So the way to sort of illustrate it, and many people do this, is here. If I don't know English or I speak a different language and I point at this and say Gavagai, I could be talking about the rabbit, I could be talking about an animal, I could be talking about the colour brown, jumping, the grass. And this is a really simple visual scene, yet you still don't really know what I'm talking about. Yet infants are born, they have all this a plethora of language around them and objects everywhere, and yet they incredibly, impressively navigate all of that and learn language really quickly. So this has led researchers to think that it's probably quite implausible that we do this without some sort of genetic ability to learn language. And this led to Chomsky's universal grammar theory. So back in 1957, I'm going to go over this quite quickly, but it's essentially just that we're born with a genetic understanding of the way in which grammar works, to the extent of we've got units, sentences, and parts of those do different things. So if I was to say the blap tomad a yok, you would sort of genetically know that there are things in that sentence doing different things, and that helps us with a structure to start learning language. So for example, a verb does something different in that sentence to a noun. The problem is with that is there are huge variances across the world at both grammatical levels and lexical levels in the way in which language is used. So it's quite hard to understand how that would really work in being an efficient way of learning all types of languages if it was really universal and genetic. It's equally not really the case that we're born and we're left to our own devices to learn language. We have a huge amount of cues. So for example, if I was trying to teach a baby the word for baby, I would say, look, it's a baby. So my pitch has increased at the word I want to teach. I'm also pointing at it. There's also gaze direction, so I would be looking and looking back to the baby. Even newborn babies can follow your eye gaze to something that you're looking at. And by 4 months, when we follow your eye gaze to another object, we process that more deeply than we've looked at that object of our own accord. So we're using these cues to our advantage, and that's helping us navigate through this language learning process. At birth, one of the huge cues that we start to use immediately is infant-directed speech. So that's that speech that we all use when we're talking to anything little. So babies, hamsters, dogs, we use that language where we go up, we go down, it's long, it's loud, you never want to hear it back. And babies prefer listening to this over adult-directed speech. So it's thought that there's something special about it. in that we learn from it and we attend to it. There must be something about the way in which we feel the need to teach like that, and babies learn from it. Postnatal experience is unlikely required for the preference because they have it at birth. But my question was, is this really evidence of genetic underpinnings? Given that, we do have evidence for processing language in the womb. So using that non-nutritional sucking paradigm we saw earlier, we know that babies prefer to listen to their mother's voice over strangers' voices. They prefer to listen to the language that they've been hearing in the womb over other languages, and even down to minor sounds. So they can distinguish between the Swedish E and the English E. And I'm not attempting to pronounce the difference between the two because I can't actually hear it. And many adults can't, but newborn babies can, and they prefer their familiar sounding version of it. So they're processing language in the womb, and it is driving their behaviour in terms of what they prefer to listen to afterwards. Some more evidence of development. So we are responding to sounds in the womb by 5 months. We can discriminate between segmented speech sounds from 36 weeks in this study, but earlier in others. Preterm fetuses can discriminate between vowel sounds E and R from 26 weeks. And they can even discriminate, using fetal heart rate, the reversal of consonant sounds. So if you repeatedly presented them with babby, 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 and then you replaced that with biba, their heart rate will change, and it's a very minor phonological difference for them to be detecting in the environment. Here's an example of that sort of study. So here we've got one of Barbara Kiselewski's study. We've got a baseline period of fetal heart rate here, and you can see heart rates changing all the time. It should. You don't want that to be a flat line. And then stimulus onset. And at that point, we've got this top line charting the fetal heart rate in response to the mother's voice, and the bottom line, the fetal heart rate in response to the stranger's voice. And you can see that they're quite divergent at that point, so they are distinguishing between mother's voice and other female voice. Dads don't need to feel left out because they will also detect dad's voice. They still show a preference for mother's voice, but it's more than likely because they actually just hear more of mum's voice, unless dad's following mum around 24/7, which nobody needs. That's probably why. So, together, this research is sort of highlighting we've got language perception in the womb, we've got learning in the womb. So, is newborn behaviour, in terms of preference for infant-directed speech, realistically genetic just because we can see it at birth? Can we measure it beforehand? So, this is, we've seen 70 families for this study. This is a subset of 30 families because it takes a very long time to code the facial movements, and that's still in process for some of these. So this is preliminary data of this. But what we did was present 2 minutes of a story to babies in the womb in infant-directed speech. In adult-directed speech, this is boring in comparison to the infant-directed speech, and then backwards infant-directed speech. The reason for presenting it backwards is that this is interesting. It still goes up, it still goes down, it's still long and loud, just like the other file, but it's not arranged in the English language anymore. The prosody of it, the melody, is different. So I'm going to attempt to play some of these now. There we go. So here's infant-directed speech.
It was a lovely day when Tim, Charlotte and Ginger were playing on the beach. The sky...
And then you've got adult-directed speech.
It was a lovely day when Tim, Charlotte and Ginger were playing on the beach. The sky was blue.
Okay. And then... And this is a lesson in why things are all well and good when you're designing these studies, but then you have to sit through that 70 times. Our sonographers are very patient with us. So we measured fetal heart rate and their movements in response to these sounds. So the question is, do we see preference for infant-directed speech before birth? Or is there a role for prenatal experience with language in this? Do we see a developing response? Does language matter? Do we see that actually it's that reverse sound file that is the one that they pay more attention to because it's different to the other two in terms of the other two are both forwards English. Can the preference for infant-directed speech be explained purely through perceptual features in terms of infant-directed speech is just more interesting than adult-directed speech? In which case, do they treat the forwards and the backwards files the same, but different to the adult-directed speech? So this is one of the things that we're seeing, and this is a bit of a longer file, just so that you can see what's happening. We've got some rest periods, and then we've got some movement of the mouth periods. So. Okay, so here are the results so far. What we're seeing is quite clearly the response to the infant-directed speech in terms of fetal heart rate for that first minute of the sound file there's very little difference between that and the adult-directed speech. But for the reverse infant-directed speech, we see this huge increase in their heart rate in comparison to the other two files. So there's something about the reverse of English that they're treating, they're giving more attention to than the other two files. What we're also then seeing is that in that second minute is the response decrement, so the heart rate is falling for all of the trials. So when we see a response decrement in any measure, usually when something new is happening, we see an increase in whatever it is that we're measuring, and then that's followed by a decrease in that. And that's because the brain's realizing I'm still dealing with the same thing. So this is habituation, which is good. It shows that we're learning throughout those 2-minute sound files that nothing has changed. Then we have the head turns here for fetal behaviour, and we've got those across the baseline period and then the sound files, and we have more movements to the reverse infant-directed speech than the adult-directed speech or the baseline period. So the interpretation of this is that language matters, because at 4 months before birth, we've got the auditory system being developed. We begin processing sounds. With experience then, we get to 6 weeks before birth. We're now seeing habituation to sound, we're seeing processing of speech, and a developing response to language. The responses here were shaped by the prosody of the familiar language. It mattered when that was played backwards, but they didn't show a preference for infant-directed speech over adult-directed speech, even though it's more interesting a file than the adult-directed speech. So there is something that happens in development between 6 weeks before birth and at birth that then becomes a preference for infant-directed speech. So what about other areas of development? So we then looked into the contagious cry, and so just to tell you a little bit about that for those who don't know, newborn babies will most of the time respond to the sound of another newborn baby crying by crying themselves. And because they don't do this in response to chimpanzee cries or older infant cries, it's thought that this is a precursor to empathy in understanding another like me, needs something, wants something. So if we all make a noise, it'll get better quickly. So it's probably, one of those evolutionary theories. Another account of this, though, is that actually it's just a reactive response to that sort of perceptual sound. And if you think about it, an older infant cry does sound quite different to that of a newborn cry if you've experienced many cries before. So in this account, the distress of another is actually not a factor in why there's a contagious cry. Equally, cries are not always for distress. They're their only communication tool at this point, so they will cry for lots of reasons. Where language comes into this quite closely, though, is that the prenatal language environment has been shown to map onto the newborn baby cry. So there are babies, and then the melody, the prosody of their cry was measured in Germany, and they showed a falling melody to their cry. This maps onto the melody of the language. French babies had a rising melody cry, which maps onto the melody and the prosody of their language. So the question here is contagious cry a genetic predisposition for empathy? Will we see it before birth? There's a pattern here that you'll see from the other study. Or is the contagious cry a communication tool that's shaped by language experience, just as their own melody of their own cry is? For example, does it matter if that cry is presented forwards or backwards? Or is the contagious cry actually just a response to particular perceptual features? So do we see more of a response to something that's a different emotion that has different perceptual features to it, for example, laughter, or a non-native cry with different perceptual features to it? So we've got we had 70 families, there's 69 families here. And we've got a native cry. This baby was listening to English in the womb. We've got that file backwards because now all of its perceptual features are the same. It's the same file, apart from the prosody of the cry. We've got a non-native cry from a baby who was listening to Mandarin in the womb, and that kind of shows the more varied perceptual features. And then laughter. Firstly, because it's a different emotion that has different perceptual features to it, and also so we didn't have to just listen to cries. So here's the native one. And here's that one backwards. And the non-native. And then laughter. It's cute. It's actually quite difficult to do that one because of all the clips of babies laughing, people then laugh with them, and I didn't want those laughs, so it was actually quite difficult to do that one. So we measured fetal heart rate and their responses. Here was really important to be looking at facial responses because a contagious cry would create expected emotional expressions, brow lowering and mouth opening. And so here's some examples of the sort of thing that we were seeing here. But I should also point out that they didn't just show cry faces. It's the star of our show, that one, all the time. Use that. Okay, so what did we see? So again, looking at the fetal heart rate, in the first minute, we see a similar response for the non-native, for the laughter, and for the native sound file. We see a different response to the reverse native sound. In the second half of the file, we see that response decrement for the native sound file, the non-native sound file, and the reverse native, so all of the cries, but we see quite a different response for the laughter. We see a sustained attentional increase. So this could be one of two things. This could be that we have a differential response to cries versus laughter that's not peer-specific, but with a small sensitivity to the difference in prosody again. So we're seeing it come up again here. Or it could be that there's little discrimination of cry sounds and just a larger novelty response to the most different sound file, which was the laughter. When we look at the head movements, we see that compared to the baseline, there's very little difference in how they respond to the cry sounds. But we see this increase in the first minute of the sound file for the laughter. So they increase their head movements more during that first minute when they start hearing laughter. So this might indicate that actually it was option B, that there's little discrimination of the cry sounds, but a big novelty response to hearing that more novel emotion sound. And what you can see here is they took it out now. Now it goes really down. Looking really now in detail at the eyebrow movements, and this is where we lose most because you need to, as you can see here, it's quite difficult to get an image with an ability to see clearly the eyebrow movements. But we still have plenty in there. So we've got the baseline period here, the 3 cries, where we see an increase in the second minute. But then for the laughter, we see something really different. We see the opposite of that effect. We've got more eyebrow movements in the first minute of the file, and then they drop off in the second. So this indicates that something different might be happening in the way that they're treating these sound files. They're treating the laughter with quite an attentional response. It's always in the first minute of that sound file, and the heart rate continues. They're not habituating to this sound file within 2 minutes. The others, they are, and they're also showing slight increases in that second minute. So it might be that actually they needed longer to develop this contagious cry response than we gave them at 2 minutes. Looking at the mouth movements, it's quite difficult to see because there's lots of mouth movements, but essentially what we see again is more movements for the reverse native sound file. So that prosody is coming up again in terms of when that's backwards, that's when they start to show more arousal. That's mostly driven by, we've got more movements in lip parting and lip pulls. So it's mostly the sort of those minor, more clear mouth movements that we're seeing. But what we're seeing more of in this one than any of the others is more of a lower lip depressor, which is this here. So the interpretation of this is, again, we've got the auditory system developed 4 months before birth. We begin processing sounds. We have experience with sounds and language, and at the stage of our studies, they're discriminating emotion sounds, and they're again showing sensitivity to prosody in the cry, but not just differences in perceptual features, because the non-native cry had quite different perceptual features. Between there and birth, we begin to get more of a reliable contagious cry, and their own cry prosody is in line with the language that they've been hearing. So you can see a developmental trajectory. So what does this mean for those theories of language acquisition that I talked about before? Essentially, we do have familiarity with language before birth. It's driving some of our newborn behaviours, and that's not really accounted for with genetic theories of how we develop language. It's sort of adding to that growing evidence base that language acquisition is not quite as overwhelming a process when we're born as we think it is, because we've been having all this experience processing and doing something with and learning language already in the womb. So what are we working on now? So we're still working on this. It's a huge field that's only just been started on, so we've not finished it yet. So we're still working on, can the things we see, hear and feel affect development before birth? When does it start to affect development? How much do we need for it to start to affect development? With what variation? How do differences in our sensory environments contribute to differences in how we develop? And to that end, I have 3 amazing PhD students. We've got Batul, who's here tonight, looking at the effects of genetics and environment on the response to infant-directed speech. So she's running these infant-directed speech studies again, but now taking account of different environmental experiences, and in this case, different emotions on a daily basis that mothers may feel. In addition to that, any differences between typically developing and those with genetic predisposition or genetic risk for autism. So just really kind of looking at those differences in genetics versus environmental potential influences on how we might be processing social stimuli before birth. We have Leonie over in New Zealand, who has a really, really lovely project looking at the development of music perception before birth. She's focusing on timbre because that is something that's different across voices. And then there's Jess, also in New Zealand, who's just finishing up her PhD now, actually, and she's got some amazing data looking at fetal lens movement in response to different visual shapes. And most of it is showing how we're better at processing in the peripheral field before birth, because that's where our eyes are best developed at that point. We've also just received some funding from the Nuffield Foundation, and this is part of a huge team here at Lancaster, University of Warwick and Durham University, looking at the effects of the prenatal environment on later postnatal outcomes in terms of educational development. The reason for this is that we've had educational reform after educational reform over the last decades, And we still don't seem to be able to help narrow the gap between children who get straight A's all the time and students that struggle, no matter how much we change our system. And it's becoming more and more evident that when they start school, it's too late. So people are starting to look a lot earlier, and we're starting with various different effects from the environment in the womb. So for example, maternal stress, malnutrition. People think of that as an international problem. It's very much not. We have a huge amount of malnutrition in the UK, and that's only getting worse with the economic crisis as it is. Maternal sleep and maternal metabolic disorders. And just to be clear, this isn't about telling people what to do around these things. There is absolutely no point in telling people, oh, just don't be stressed, because that's not helpful at all. But it is about just providing information to families. I've helped enough friends through having children to know that constantly what stresses them out throughout pregnancy is having a lack of control and not knowing what to do, agonising over, do I move house now or when the baby's born? And it's just nice to be able to have that information to be able to make decisions. We've got lots of recommendations over whether or not to drink alcohol or smoke, but those everyday decisions that we all have to make, we have no information on because we simply don't know. It's also about being able to give information to the government to be able to put funding and resources in the right place. We do have support for people who are in extreme categories of stress, but we don't have enough support for the people in the mid-range who maybe are having daily life stresses. And this sort of thing can provide evidence to get money and resources in the right place to help families. Long term though, my goal is to improve outcomes for preterm infants. So 8% of babies in the UK are born preterm. That's anything before 37 weeks. Many of them are born much earlier, and there's usually biological predictors of this, but many of them aren't. They're born later towards these 37 weeks phase, and there are no predictors to this, but they are at increased risk for developmental difficulties and delays, but we don't know why. It could be that we're introduced to a sensory environment that's too complex too early, and that overloads the system for some of these babies. In which case, a lot of this work, the aim of it is to go towards understanding more about what should the environment be, what is the environment before birth, how do they respond to it, what information do they need, what is too much, what is too little. Some of this work is already in NICU wards. So, for example, the way in which they're run mostly is to encourage families to be in the ward as much as they possibly can. They don't have visiting hours, and they're encouraged to speak as much as possible to the babies. Yet, we're still finding that there's 5 times more speech around babies in utero than there is around preterm infants in the wards. We also have a very different visual environment, and this can affect circadian rhythm. So you've got a lot of artificial light. The healthcare teams need to get in to do other things typically with these infants, but at the same time we don't really know enough about what that visual environment should look like. So on the other hand though, it may be that these babies were already showing increased developmental delays. But because we don't know what typical development is at that point, because these studies have just started, we don't really know if that's the case. So part of the goal of these studies is to identify patterns of expected behaviours in response to shapes and sounds, so that we can have a look at patterns of unexpected responses. Some of those may well be a marker for whether or not babies will be born preterm and or have later developmental difficulties, so that healthcare teams and families can get that help in place. So just to thank, and you'll see here that I tried to include a lot of these in my presentation. It was getting longer and longer because this is very much not a one-man band, and I was just mentioning names consistently. So I've had to put them on a slide here, but you can see just how many people make this work. And mostly, I am going to mention the incredible families that take part in our research, because not a single bit of this presentation would have run without the families that bring their babies in. And families are inherently busy people, so that they'd still bring their babies in and take the time to come and see us is very much appreciated. So that is me.